Hey everyone, and welcome. I am absolutely pumped to guide you through this explainer today. We're going to see how literature isn't just, a bunch of old books gathering dust. It's actually this incredibly dynamic evolution of human ideals stretching across millennia. We're literally tracing the history of the written word to discover how it has continuously shaped and been shaped by society.
Let's kick things off with a seriously powerful thought from Goethe. Literature is the humanization of the whole world. I love this because it reminds us that literature literally preserves the ideals, the dreams, and the immense progress of civilizations that would otherwise just entirely vanish. Think about it. While cities crumble and governments fall, these huge ideals like freedom, love, and duty, they are caught and held forever in prose and poetry.
To see how this actually works, we're going to trace the hero's journey of the written word. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. Origins of literary criticism. 2. Forging the English tongue. 3. Reason and romantic revolt. 4. The Victorian moral mirror. And 5. Modernism and the reader. All right, let's jump right in.
Our story starts all the way back with the ancient Greeks, who established a canon of classic texts. Now, originally these were just oral traditions passed down by word of mouth. But over time, especially thanks to Alexandrian scholars, they were formalized into a set tradition of fixed texts. And these weren't just for entertainment. They became the ultimate fixed authorities for moral and public education across the whole Hellenistic world.
Section 1. Origins of literary criticism. We're time-traveling back to ancient Athens, where poetry definitely wasn't just some abstract art form. No way. It was a crucial public and political necessity, completely woven into the fabric of the state.
A really foundational concept you have to grasp here is mimesis. In early Greek culture, mimesis wasn't just simple imitation. It was the actual reenactment through ritual of the events of myth. This meant the poet was speaking with the universal, unchanging authority of those ancient myths. It was basically an implicit promise to the audience. The performer wouldn't just change up the story for local flavor, but would deliver the exact authoritative performance every single time.
You really have to view this through the lens of the Greek polis, or the city-state. Try to picture ancient dramatic festivals exactly like our modern mass media. I mean, in a society where people literally assembled in person to deal with their problems, the theater was the ultimate public forum. Religion, culture, morality, these were critical public concerns, and the dramatic festivals were where citizens were educated and where huge debates were sparked right in the heart of the polis. And right here is where the drama actually starts, with a massive clash between two intellectual heavyweights. Plato, well, he wanted to censor the unpredictable, mythical vision of poets. He argued that poetry appeals to our irrational, lower natures, depicting gods behaving badly, and distracts us from the rational pursuit of truth. But his student, Aristotle, pushed back. He defended poetry, arguing that literature, especially tragedy, provides this essential emotional release. It inspires a purgative fear and pity in the audience, and ultimately reveals universal human traits rather than just random individual quirks. All right, moving right along to Section 2, Forging the English Tongue. We're going to watch this tradition leap forward in time and onto English soil to forge an entirely new national voice.
Just like the Greeks preserved their ideals in stone and poetry, early English monks began copying down these raw, crude, pagan oral sagas. By writing them down, they gave these wild, native stories a religious, structured framework. Piece by piece, they were literally preserving the ideals of a growing nation through the written word.
And it's amazing how fast the English language evolved. In 449 AD, we've got early Anglo-Saxon pagan sagas brought over by the tribes. Then, bam, 1066 hits, the Norman Conquest, and we see this massive shift as French and Anglo-Saxon blend together. Fast forward to 1340 and the age of Chaucer, and the Midland dialect is actively being developed into a standardized national speech, solidified forever by Chaucer's brilliant storytelling.
Speaking of those early pagan sagas, I absolutely love historian William J. Long's observation on this. He points out that the foundational ideal in the ancient poem Beowulf, which is all about man conquering the terrifying forces of nature, is actually the blueprint for all our modern sciences. It's that immortal dream that humanity can tame the wild world around it. It just goes to show that literature is the cradle of even our most practical, scientific advancements. How cool is that?
This foundational language perfectly sets the stage for the booming Elizabethan age. Talk about a creative explosion. This era was just overflowing with unprecedented patriotic enthusiasm. There was this incredible vigor and romantic impulse of youth sweeping the country. Writers embraced a natural, highly emotional style, which obviously culminated in the absolute pinnacle of dramatic arts with writers like Christopher Marlowe and, of course, William Shakespeare.
But as we know, history is a giant pendulum. Section 3. Reason and Romantic Revolt. All that chaotic passion of the Elizabethans, it soon triggered a massive cultural backlash.
We basically see a stark contrast between two entirely different, warring eras. On one side, you have 18th century classicism, where writers like Pope and Johnson were just obsessed with rigid rules, intellectual realism, and precise formalism. And on the flip side, you have the explosive romantic revolt of writers like Wordsworth and Byron, who completely rejected those rules to champion wild hopes, deep emotion, and the triumph of democracy.
Let's zoom in on that classic age for a second. During the 18th century, writing naturally or with unbridled passion was a huge faux pas, totally out. You had to follow strict formulas. Writers actively strove to repress emotion, treating literature exactly like the elaborate, precise social codes of the time. Just as a gentleman had to follow incredibly rigid rules for doffing his hat in polite society, a poet had to follow rigid structural rules on the page. No exceptions.
But then, fueled by the massive political upheavals of the American and French revolutions, the Romantics came along and literally tore up that rulebook. Literature began mirroring the wild hopes of the time. They embraced nature, they elevated the common person, and they just celebrated the sheer joy of living. They tossed out those precise social codes to champion the beautiful, immortal ideal of a free and equal manhood.
Which brings us to Section 4, the Victorian moral mirror. As we roll into the 19th century, society shifts gear yet again. The wild enthusiasm of the Romantics starts to fade, and people begin desperately looking for practical meaning in a rapidly industrializing world.
Notice how incredibly practical literature became during this time. The Victorian conscience was heavily focused on everyday practical problems. Heavyweights like Dickens and George Eliot married literature to a strongly ethical and moral purpose. Heavily influenced by new scientific principles like evolution, they used their novels not just to entertain us, but to vigorously attack materialism. They demanded social reform and effectively held a huge moral mirror right up to society.
There's a quote from John Milton that, even though it was written much earlier, completely nails the Victorian view of literature. A good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit. They didn't see books as just, imaginative playthings. To them, literature was the lifeblood of a master spirit. It was the absolute primary instrument for progress, for education, and for feeding the spiritually hungry in an increasingly mechanical age.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Modernism and the Reader. We hit the 20th century. The Victorian moral certainty completely shatters, and the very foundations of who controls the meaning of a text are deeply, deeply challenged.
The modern era introduces us to some pretty complex concepts, like deconstruction, pioneered by figures like Jacques Derrida, and really nicely defined here by Barbara Johnson. The absolutely crucial thing to remember is that deconstruction is not the same as destruction. It's not about just randomly doubting or burning a book down. Actually, scratch that. It's more like dismantling the claim that one single interpretation gets to dominate all the others. It reveals that language is fragmented, and no single historical narrative has absolute, unquestioned authority.
This modern, critical mindset was a total game changer. It allowed brilliant critics like Virginia Woolf to expose massive historical contradictions. She astutely pointed out that while a woman, in her words, dominates the lives of kings and conquerors in fiction, in real life she could hardly read and was the property of her husband. Modernist criticism became this incredibly sharp tool to show how idealized representations in literature often completely mask the harsh, marginalized realities of actual history.
And that sets us up for the final major pivot in our journey. Thinkers like Stanley Fish and Norman Holland proposed a genuinely radical idea. What if the author doesn't have the final say? Literary criticism pivots away from the author's intent straight to the reader's active cognitive response. That means it is actually you, the reader, bringing your own unique life experiences who creates the final meaning of a text. Literature becomes this dynamic, interactive process, not just a static object sitting on a page.
Which leads us with a fascinating final thought to ponder today. We've watched literature evolve from ancient Greek myths claiming absolute authority all the way to modern texts where the reader takes center stage. If literature really is merely a mirror for the reader's own mind, what hidden truths did you just discover about yourself through the history we've explored? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I highly encourage you to keep questioning, keep reading, and keep finding your own meaning.